The mirror. The server core burned white-hot as Julian's hands blistered. And somewhere in the facility's depths, his sister's face, displayed as a hologram, screaming soundlessly, finally found peace before erasing into smoke. But the real horror wasn't the fire. It was the certainty that would come later. The knowledge that the woman he'd trusted had known all along, that his sister had been alive all these years, hidden in some clinic in Vermont while he grieved. And that was only after he discovered his mentor had orchestrated everything, his career, his pain, his very presence in that recording studio, as part of a test to see how human suffering could be weaponized. 13 hours earlier, Julian sat at a desk in a dimly lit recording studio in downtown Brooklyn, his right hand shaking slightly as it adjusted the cold metal of a Sennheiser MD421 microphone. The studio was small, soundproofed, hermetic. Outside the glass, rain drummed against the Brooklyn night. The ventilation system hummed its low, constant note beneath everything else. He pulled a yellow legal pad toward him. His handwriting was the only thing in the room that didn't feel controlled, the pen pressed too hard, the letters uneven. At the top of the page, underlined twice, were the words, "Project Mirror, the cost of truth." Below it, his questions began. How much do they know about us? What happens when they know too much? Can data become prophecy? Julian clicked his pen. The rhythm was involuntary, anxious. Click, clack, click, clack. His left foot tapped beneath the desk in time with the clicking. The Focusrite Scarlet sat ready, its red light like an unblinking eye. In 7 minutes, the person who would change everything was supposed to walk through that door. He whispered to himself, barely audible even in the silence. Deep breaths. Just a conversation. The clock on the wall read 7 p.m. exactly when the heavy steel door creaked open. She entered like someone stepping into hostile territory, scanning the corners, the shadows, the spaces where microphones or cameras might be hidden. Water dripped from her black umbrella, leaving small pools on the linoleum floor. She wore an olive-green trench coat, soaked through. The silver Rimowa briefcase in her hand gleamed under the fluorescent light, expensive and incongruous against her haunted expression. This was Maya. Julian stood up. His chair scraped loudly across the floor. Too loud, he thought. He reached his hand across the desk in the automatic gesture of greeting, but Maya ignored it entirely. She placed the briefcase on the table between them like a barrier, and sat in the guest chair with her spine perfectly straight, her shoulders tensed so high they nearly touched her ears. Her knuckles were white around the briefcase handle. "Thank you for coming," Julian said, trying to sound reassuring. "I know the risk." Maya's eyes cut toward him, cold and sharp as glass. "You have no idea. Start the recording." Julian didn't hesitate. He reached for the audio interface and pressed the circular red button. The digital display lit up with a timer. 0001. The machine was now listening. Everything they said from this moment forward would be preserved, stored, archived. In some distant server farm, maybe it was already being archived somewhere else too, though neither of them could have known that yet. Maya unzipped her coat, revealing nothing but a simple black turtleneck beneath. She leaned forward into the microphone's radius, her hands flattening on the mahogany desk. Only the lower half of her face was illuminated by the desk lamp. It made her look like she was speaking from a grave. "It's not just data, Julian. It's a map of the soul. Project Mirror finds the crack in your foundation, the thing you never told anyone. And it uses it to predict when you'll break." Julian's pen moved across the legal pad, but not in any ordered way. He wrote, "The crack. You were the blueprint," Julian said. And it wasn't a question. Maya's fingers flew to her sleeves, tugging them down quickly, defensively. But her eyes had widened, and they darted toward the studio door. A sound had penetrated the soundproofed walls, the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway outside. "Someone followed me," Maya whispered, her voice dropping to almost nothing. "We need to leave, now." Julian didn't argue. He stood up, grabbing the briefcase and the USB drive. He shoved the drive deep into his pocket and kicked the studio door open so hard it crashed against the rubber stopper. A man in a charcoal suit stood in the hallway. His hand was already reaching inside his jacket. The man's eyes, flat, professional, didn't register surprise. He was exactly where he wanted to be. Julian didn't think. He swung the silver Rimowa briefcase like a weapon, aiming for the man's face. The metal connected with his nose in a sickening crunch. Blood sprayed across the white hallway wallpaper, creating a pattern that looked almost abstract. The man staggered, his hand closing around Julian's throat with one enormous, vice-like grip. Julian's feet lifted off the ground. 2 inches. 3. His vision began to darken at the edges. The man, an agent of something, Julian realized, some organization he didn't yet know the name of, was squeezing with mechanical precision. No emotion, no effort, just the steady application of lethal force. Maya screamed and kicked at the agent's knee. Her boot connected with a dull, wet sound. The agent's grip loosened just enough for Julian to drop back to his feet. His hand found the brass tape dispenser on the reception desk beside them. He swung it in a short, vicious arc. The impact was sudden and absolute. The agent's grip released entirely, and he collapsed like a sack of stones, his eyes rolling back until only the whites were visible. "The roof," Julian gasped, his throat on fire. "My car is in the alley." He grabbed Maya's hand. Her palm was freezing, shaking as badly as his own. They ran toward the red exit sign that glowed at the end of the dark corridor like a destination, like salvation, like an exit that would turn out to be no exit at all. They made it down 3 flights of stairs and through a delivery bay before the fire escape deposited them in the alley. Rain hammered down on them with almost biblical intensity. That's when a black Cadillac Escalade skidded to a halt, blocking their path. 2 men in tactical vests jumped out. The first one swung a collapsible steel baton. Julian ducked, and the metal whistled past his head, connecting with a metal trash can in a violent gong that echoed off the brick walls. Sparks flew. Julian grabbed a heavy wooden pallet leaning against the wall and hurled it forward. The wood splintered as it hit the first man in the chest, driving him backward into a stack of cardboard boxes that exploded under his weight. The second cleaner grabbed Maya by her hair. She screamed, a sound of pure terror and rage, and bit down on his forearm hard enough to taste blood. He backhanded her with casual brutality, sending her flying into a puddle. She landed hard, the wind knocked out of her, water soaking through her coat instantly. Julian charged him without thinking. He tackled the man into the side of the SUV, and they collided with a heavy thud that left them both gasping. Julian slammed the man's head against the window. The safety glass spiderwebbed under the impact but held. He did it again, and again. 3 rapid punches to the ribs. The man saged, his arms dropping. Julian pulled Maya out of the puddle and dragged her toward his battered 2005 Honda Civic, which was parked half-hidden behind a dumpster. They scrambled inside. He started the engine and didn't look back. The rain was so heavy that the windshield wipers couldn't keep up. Julian's hands were shaking on the wheel, his left bleeding from a cut across the knuckles. He drove erratically, taking random turns, trying to lose any pursuit. Eventually, when he was reasonably sure they weren't being followed, he made his way to his apartment in Park Slope. It wasn't a safe house. He'd never planned to need one. But it would have to do. His apartment was a disaster of his own making. Scattered coffee cups, notebooks, papers covering every surface. He sat at his desk and plugged the blue USB drive into his MacBook Pro. The screen glowed blue as it reflected his sweat-streaked face. The drive was immediately active, displaying a progress bar, decrypting. Maya stood by the window, peeking through the wooden blinds. Her knuckles were white around the ceramic mug of tea she held. Outside, the street was quiet. She kept waiting for the next intrusion, the next collapse of safety. The laptop emitted a sharp ping. A window opened. A countdown timer appeared, red and urgent. 59, 59, 59, 58. Below it, a file name. ProJMirror user log Julian Marsh. Text. Julian's throat went tight. That was his name, his file. Why is my name here, Maya? His voice came out low and menacing in a way he didn't recognize in himself. Maya turned from the window, but couldn't meet his eyes. Instead, she looked at a framed photo on his bookshelf. It showed Julian and his sister Sarah, 5 years younger in the photo than in his most recent memories. She was smiling. He looked genuinely happy, a version of himself he couldn't quite remember being. I didn't choose you at random, Maya said, and her voice was broken, fractured. The firm has been watching you since the accident. They knew you were the only one who would take this story. They wanted to see if I could manipulate your grief. Julian slammed his fist on the desk. The coffee cups rattled and one fell, spilling cold liquid onto his notes. He stood up so abruptly, his chair flew backward. His shadow loomed enormous against the white wall. You used me? He shouted. This isn't a whistleblow, it's a test? He didn't wait for an answer. He grabbed his keys and pulled Maya out of the apartment before she could respond. They needed to move. Staying still meant dying. He could feel it in the quality of the silence outside, in the way his skin prickled with the certainty of pursuit. They took the back fire escape, descending into darkness. The alley behind his building was narrow and lined with industrial debris. As their feet hit the wet pavement, a black SUV appeared at the far end, skidding to a halt and blocking their exit. 2 men emerged. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of professionals. Julian looked at the fire escape, the walls, the barriers. Then he grabbed Maya's hand and ran toward the far end of the alley, looking for a gap between buildings, some narrow passage that might lead them out. There wasn't one. The alley was a dead end. Julian turned to face them. The first man swung a baton again, and this time the alley was too narrow for Julian to dodge effectively. The metal grazed his shoulder, and he felt white-hot pain lance through his arm. He grabbed a length of rusted rebar leaning against the wall and threw it like a javelin. It missed the first man, but struck the side of the SUV, denting the metal with a loud crunch. The second man rushed at him. Julian braced for the impact, but Maya stepped forward and shoved a metal trash can directly into the man's path. He tripped, went sprawling, and didn't get up. The first man recovered and came at Julian with renewed aggression, the baton whistling through the air. Julian was faster. He sidestepped and grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it until the baton clattered to the ground. A quick elbow strike to the temple, and the man went down hard. The car, Julian gasped. We need the car, now. He'd parked a stolen Honda Civic 3 blocks away. He'd learned long ago that owning nothing meant leaving no trail. They ran through the rain, slipping on wet pavement, pushing themselves harder than their bodies could reasonably sustain. When they finally reached the car, Julian's hands were shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. As he drove through the pre-dawn darkness of Brooklyn, weaving through traffic, Maya sat in the passenger seat with the MacBook on her lap. The timer was down to 24:12. She opened directories with a speed that suggested this wasn't her first time navigating encrypted systems. She found what she was looking for, a hidden directory labeled Architect Files. Inside was a photograph of an older man in a lab coat, wearing gold-rimmed glasses. He was smiling, a grandfatherly expression that probably inspired confidence in research subjects. Julian recognized him immediately. His stomach lurched. "That's Dr. Aris," Maya said quietly. "Your mentor." "Look at the metadata, Julian. He's not just a consultant. He owns the patent. He created Project Mirror." Julian swerved the car. He reached into the glove box with his right hand while keeping his left on the wheel. He pulled out a worn business card. Dr. Elias Aris, Ethics in Technology. The card was yellowed and creased from 5 years in the darkness of the glove box. "He told me he retired years ago," Julian said, his voice hollow. "He's the one who gave me the lead on this story. He set me up to find you." The phone on the dashboard began to vibrate. The caller ID flashed. Dr. Aris. His name appeared on the screen again and again, each flash like an accusation. Julian grabbed the phone and hurled it out the driver's side window. It bounced off the pavement and was crushed by a following truck. The screen went dark. "We're going to the server farm," Julian said. His hands had stopped shaking, which was somehow worse than the shaking. "We end this where it starts." The facility was a sprawling complex of concrete and steel on the outskirts of industrial New Jersey. No signage, no indication of what happened inside the building. Just blank walls and surveillance cameras that rotated with mechanical precision. Julian used wire cutters to breach the fence. The metal snapped with sharp pings, ping, 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 each one a small alarm bell. They slipped through the gap and into a sterile concrete courtyard. A security camera rotated nearby, its red light sweeping across the ground like a lighthouse beam searching for prey. The interior was worse. Long hallways lined with polished chrome panels that acted as mirrors. Julian saw dozens of reflections of himself, each one looking battered, desperate, haunted. Maya walked beside him, staring at her own reflection with an expression of deep disgust, not at her appearance, but at the concept itself. Infinite copies of a person, none of them real, all of them trapped. "This is what they want," Maya whispered. Everyone trapped in their own image. The low, deep thrum of thousands of servers behind the walls created a sound that was almost subliminal. A vibration Julian felt in his bones rather than heard in his ears. They rounded a corner and found 3 guards in black riot gear blocking their path. They carried transparent polycarbonate shields that linked together in a wall formation. Batons hung from their belts like weapons waiting to be deployed. Julian didn't hesitate. He grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall, red metal, heavy, designed to save lives, and pulled the pin. He sprayed the white chemical foam directly at the guards' visors. The hallway filled with clouds of white, turning everything into a void, removing depth and dimension from the world. In the chaos, Julian charged. He gripped the heavy metal base of the extinguisher and swung it at the nearest shield. The polycarbonate shattered under the impact, and the guard behind it stumbled backward. Julian followed up with a shoulder tackle, driving the man into one of the chrome panels. The panel cracked under the impact, splintering into 100 pieces. Julian's own fractured reflection stared back at him from the breaking mirror. A man transformed into multiplicity, into chaos, into something that no longer resembled anything human. They pushed deeper into the facility. Behind the guards, Julian found the path to the central hub. He didn't know where he was going, but his body moved with a kind of desperate momentum that required no conscious direction. The core room was circular, its glass floor transparent. Below the glass, cool blue liquid flowed over server racks, a glacial sea of computational power. Aris sat in a white ergonomic chair at the center of it all, completely composed, holding an iPad Pro as if nothing was wrong, as if the facility wasn't being torn apart by intruders. "Julian?" Aris said, and there was a note of fatherly disappointment in his voice. "You were always the most predictable of my students. That's why I chose you." Julian pointed a jagged piece of the broken fire extinguisher at the old man. His hands were trembling, not from fear, but from rage so pure it was almost religious. Maya stood behind him, her face ashen, her eyes empty. "You killed them?" Julian's voice was shaky, broken by gasps for breath. "You used everyone's pain to build this?" Aris swiped on his iPad without responding. A hologram erupted into being in the center of the room, translucent blue light forming the shape of a hospital bed. And in that bed was Sarah, Julian's sister. Wires were attached to her temples. Her mouth was open, and her eyes were wide with a terror so profound that it didn't look human. "The accident was a synaptic overload, Julian," Aris said with the tone of someone explaining basic mathematics to a child. "We tried to map her grief for your mother. She couldn't handle the reflection. Most people can't. That's why we need to curate it for them. To help them, really. To make their suffering useful." Julian dropped the metal shard. It rang out as it hit the glass, a pure, crystalline tone that seemed to hang in the air. He fell to his knees, staring at the holographic image of his sister being tortured. He reached out to touch the light, but his fingers passed right through it. The light was there and not there simultaneously, a phantom of something that had been taken from him. "She was my only family," he said, and the words came out as sobs. Two guards emerged from the shadows. They grabbed Julian and Maya with precise professionalism, forcing them to their knees. Aris stood up and walked to the edge of the glass floor. He looked down at Julian like a scientist observing a specimen in a lab. "Now, you'll join the archive," Aris said. "You'll be the betrayed student profile. Perfect for the next phase." They were pushed into a small glass-walled room within the core, a containment cell. A magnetic lock engaged behind them with a heavy, final sound. Clack, shoo! Julian hammered his fists against the glass, but it didn't even vibrate. The walls were designed to withstand pressure, designed to hold their occupants. Through the glass, Julian watched Aris walk away, his back turned, his white suit somehow still pristine despite the chaos around them. Maya slumped against the far wall. She reached into Julian's pocket and pulled out the blue USB drive. The red timer was flashing urgently. 01:59, 01:58. The numbers counted down with mechanical indifference. "It's not an encryption timer, Julian," Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a physical self-destruct. The drive is a thermite charge. When it hits zero, it melts the hardware, destroys everything." Julian felt his ears pop. The air pressure in the room was changing. A vent near the ceiling began to emit a high-pitched whine, air rushing out, being drawn away to maintain the perfect climate for the servers. His vision started to blur at the edges. "If we get it into the intake," Julian said, strangled, his brain working even as his body began to fail, "it kills the whole system." He pulled his leather belt off and examined the heavy steel buckle. He began scraping at the seal of the glass door, searching for a gap, any opening where he might slide the drive through. His movements became more frantic as the air grew thinner. Metal screeched against glass. His vision was narrowing to a tunnel. He fell. The lack of oxygen was a physical presence now, a weight pressing down on his chest, making every breath a wheeze. He lay on the floor, the drive in his palm. The timer read, 0:45. Maya had already passed out beside him, her head lolling at an unnatural angle. Julian's consciousness began to flicker like a light failing. Darkness crept in from the edges of his vision. But in that darkness, something caught his attention. A sticker on the bottom of the drive. He forced his dying eyes to focus. Beta 88 override. Maya's profile, her designation in their system, her secret. There was a small maintenance port at the base of the glass wall, barely visible in the darkness. Julian crawled toward it, dragging himself inch by inch across the glass floor. His vision had narrowed to a point. His hearing was a distant roar. But he moved. The port had a number etched into its metal face. 88. His fingers were barely functional, but Julian managed to jam the drive into the port. The red timer hit 0010. There was a series of rapid beeps, accelerating, urgent. The magnetic lock on the door failed with a bang. Oxygen rushed into the room like a physical force. Julian's chest heaved as he gasped for air, pulling it into his lungs in great, desperate drafts. The world rushed back into focus. He grabbed the drive. It was burning his hand, searing his palm, and lunged out of the door. He sprinted to the central cooling intake of the server hub. The blue liquid churned below, a glacial sea of computational infrastructure. He hurled the drive into the intake. It vanished into the blue liquid with a splash and a sizzle. The timer hit 0:00. A massive white flash erupted from the tank. The blue liquid turned into steam in an instant, boiling away into vapor. Sparks flew from every server rack in the room. The holographic image of Sarah, still screaming in that soundless way, began to destabilize. The projection broke apart, pixelating, losing coherence. For a moment, her face found peace, before vanishing entirely into light, and then into nothing. The lights in the facility began to flicker and die. Red emergency strobes kicked in, casting everything in an apocalyptic glow. Multiple electrical explosions thundered through the core room, each one sending cascades of sparks into the air. Julian pulled Maya out of the room, carrying her over his shoulder. Behind them, the heart of Project Mirror was a smoking ruin. The alarms had begun to wail, "We owe, we owe." A sound of machines in distress, of systems failing, of the architecture of God collapsing. The roof. Julian knew somehow that Aris would go to the roof. There was no other escape left. He climbed the emergency stairs with Maya limp against him. Each step was agony, his ribs screaming, his legs failing, his mind fracturing under the weight of exhaustion and grief and rage. He emerged onto the roof to find a helicopter hovering close, its spotlight washing over everything in brilliant white. Aris stood at the edge of the roof in his pristine white suit, frantically swiping at an iPad Pro. The rotor blades of the helicopter whop-whopped overhead, creating a wind that tore at Aris's hair and clothes. "I can restart." Aris was screaming over the noise. "I have the source code." Julian laid Maya down carefully, then approached Aris with a heavy industrial wrench he found lying among the roofing debris. He threw it without warning. The wrench caught Aris in the wrist with a sickening crack. The old man howled, and the iPad flew from his hand, skidding across the gravel-covered roof. Julian tackled Aris, pinning him near the edge. The old man's hands came up, trying to gouge for Julian's eyes with his thumbs. They struggled on the gravel, their bodies rolling dangerously close to the 50-story drop. Julian grabbed Aris by the lapels and slammed him down. Then he reached over and grabbed the iPad. He held it over the edge of the building, over the void, over the long fall to pavement below. On the screen, a backup process was running. Backup 98% complete. You wanted to know the truth about me, Aris? Julian said, his voice deadly calm. Here it is. I'm not a file. He let go. The tablet fell into the darkness. Its screen continued to glow as it descended, a small blue light falling like a dying star. A second later, the helicopter's spotlight followed it down until it hit the pavement far below. The screen shattered. The connection died. On the facility's monitors below, the backup icon turned red. Disconnected. The data that couldn't be encrypted, that couldn't be stored, that couldn't be weaponized, was gone. Julian stood there on the roof, breathing in the rain, watching the city lights reflect off the river miles away. He was still alive. Maya was still alive. Aris had been taken away by the authorities, or maybe he'd thrown himself off the roof. Julian couldn't quite remember clearly. And the facility behind them was burning itself to ash. As the sun began to rise, Julian and Maya found themselves sitting on a weathered wooden bench by the Brooklyn waterfront. Their clothes were torn and stained with blood and ash. Julian had a bandage over his eye. The sky was a pale lavender and orange, the colors of a new day that felt impossibly unearned. The Manhattan skyline was reflected in the calm water of the river. It looked like a dream, like something that wasn't real, like the reflection of something real that existed somewhere else, in some other dimension where the rules made sense. We have nothing, Maya said softly. No story to publish, no proof Aris exists, no backup of the files, nothing. Julian reached out and took her hand. He didn't look at her. He looked at the sun rising over the water. Her hand was warm now. Her trembling had finally stopped. We know the truth, Julian said quietly. That's enough for now. Maya reached into her boot and pulled out a tiny, crumpled Polaroid photo. She handed it to Julian without a word. The photograph showed a young woman. Julian recognized her immediately, smiling at a birthday cake. Sarah, his sister. She was alive in this image, happy, real. The photo was dated on the back, June 12th, 2 days after the synaptic overload that supposedly killed her. She survived, Maya whispered. For a while, I smuggled her out to a clinic in Vermont. She's not a file, Julian. She's a person, and she's alive. Julian stared at the photograph. Tears rolled down his cheeks, not from grief this time, but from something else entirely. He gripped the photo like it was the most valuable thing in the world. He looked at Maya, and for the first time, there was no fear in his eyes, no paranoia, no haunting. Let's go find her, he said. They stood up together and walked away from the bench, toward the city, as the sun continued to rise over the water. Their shadows stretched out ahead of them into the new day, two shapes moving forward into a future that no algorithm could predict, no file could contain, no system could weaponize. The city was waking up around them, the car horns, the distant sound of a train, people beginning their days, the ordinary, beautiful sound of life continuing without them, indifferent to their survival, unconcerned with their pain. Julian held the Polaroid in one hand and Maya's hand in the other. He walked forward into the light, and there was nothing behind him now but ash and silence and the ruins of a system that had tried to turn human suffering into data. The river flowed past. The city continued. The sun climbed higher in the sky, burning away the last of the night. They walked north along the waterfront, past the old ferry terminals and the warehouses being converted into luxury apartments, past the tourists who were just beginning to fill the sidewalks, past the ordinary people with their ordinary problems and their ordinary lives. Julian's phone, borrowed from a stranger, sat in his pocket. He didn't know the number for any clinic in Vermont. He didn't know how to begin searching for someone who had been hidden away for 5 years. But he had the date on the photograph. He had Maya's testimony. He had the polaroid itself, proof that someone believed his sister was alive. They walked on as the morning grew brighter. The bandage over Julian's eye was already soaking through with fresh blood from a cut that hadn't fully healed. His ribs ached with each breath. His hands were wrapped in gauze, and the gauze was stained red. But he was alive. Maya was alive. And somewhere in Vermont, in some small clinic whose name Maya couldn't quite remember, his sister might be alive too. That would have to be enough. That would have to be the beginning. They continued walking, away from the waterfront, away from the smoldering facility behind them, away from the life Julian had been living, and into whatever came next. The sidewalk was crowded with morning commuters, with people rushing to jobs, with the dense, ordinary texture of a city waking up. They were invisible in the crowd, unremarkable, just 2 more people moving through the city. That was the best they could hope for now. To be invisible, to be forgotten, to be left alone. Julian pulled out the Polaroid one more time and looked at his sister's face. She was smiling at the birthday cake, frozen in a moment of joy. A moment before everything changed. He tucked the photo back into his pocket, close to his heart. They walked on.